What I'm about to share may shock you, but if you're watching this video right now, it's not by coincidence. You're here because something powerful is happening in your life. You are shifting from feeling powerless to taking control. The same way the FBI might call someone a serial killer of corrupt agendas, you've become someone who destroys excuses, breaks down barriers, and exposes the systems that held you back. In a world where corrupt departments, broken systems, and high-profile figures have misused their positions and taken advantage of ordinary people, you represent the rising force that pressures the whole operation into a collective panic, not through violence, but through truth, discipline, and unstoppable determination. People talk about mysterious disappearances of old habits, toxic influences, and the corrupt patterns that once controlled your life. Nobody knows how they vanished, but you do. You eliminated them piece by piece, and now those corrupted mindsets are scrambling, correcting their files, trying to run from the new version of you. The headlines of your life are about to change, and the world will recognize you as someone who destroys corruption, not in society, but in yourself. Brother, we did it. Brother, you did this. Now it's time to finish what you started and rewrite your entire story. Before we go deeper, pause this video, hit that like button, subscribe so we can reach 5,000 subscribers, and drop the name Mr. Ledger in the comments to show you're fully locked into this new chapter. Now let's get into it. There are moments in history when everyday individuals without titles or influence rise above expectations and become catalysts for transformation, not because they sought fame or recognition, but because they refused to look away from wrongdoing. Their strength comes from their persistence, from the quiet courage that grows in people who have had enough of being ignored or dismissed. When someone stands up with honesty and conviction, they become more powerful than institutions that have operated unchecked for decades. What makes these individuals extraordinary is not perfection. It's the willingness to show up even when the odds seem impossible. They realize that their voice matters, their actions matter, and their courage can inspire thousands who feel the same, but are afraid to take the first step. By choosing truth over silence, they transform from passive observers into unstoppable forces for accountability. And once ordinary people awaken to their own strength, they rewrite the rules. They challenge norms that were never fair, question narratives that were never accurate, and demand a future built on fairness and transparency. Their bravery becomes contagious, lighting a path for others to walk with confidence. Institutions that have operated behind closed doors for years are suddenly feeling the pressure, not through rebellion or chaos, but through exposure, through documents, audits, whistleblowers, and communities united by clarity. When truth shows up, corruption trembles because it knows it cannot survive in daylight. What once looked powerful now looks fragile, stitched together by secrecy rather than integrity. The panic arises not because of threats, but because of evidence, because people are demanding answers, asking logical questions, and refusing to be brushed aside. When ordinary citizens pay attention, systems that depended on public distraction start to unravel. Accountability isn't loud, it's persistent, structured, and undeniable. And as accountability arrives, those who once acted untouchable realize the ground beneath them is shifting. The fear they feel isn't of people, it's of consequences, of transparency, of the truth they worked so hard to bury, finally surfacing for everyone to see. It surprises many, but corrupt systems often fear honest people, far more than any rule breaker. Criminals can be predicted. They follow patterns that institutions know how to manage. But honest citizens who refuse to stay silent, they are unpredictable in the best possible way. They don't want deals, shortcuts, or favors. They want justice, They want fairness. They want answers. Honest people aren't controlled by manipulation, intimidation, or false promises. They operate from clarity, not self-interest. And that terrifies systems built on deception, because when someone speaks up with nothing to hide, the truth they carry echoes louder than any accusation a corrupt agency can fabricate. This fear comes from knowing that honesty spreads. One person willing to question something inspires 10 others. 10 become 100. 100 become a movement. And when honesty becomes a collective force, even the strongest systems must confront what they've avoided for years. Old power structures rarely collapse in a dramatic instant. It's usually a slow unraveling, a chain reaction triggered by questions they cannot answer, by evidence they cannot escape, and by people they can no longer manipulate. Each truth revealed removes one more brick from the foundations they believed were unshakable. These structures crumble because they were never built to last. They were built on shortcuts, favoritism, double standards, and unspoken deals that couldn't withstand real scrutiny. Once the public begins paying attention, the cracks widen. Once accountability enters the picture, the excuses fall apart, and suddenly, the systems that claimed dominance look disorganized and frantic. Their collapse is not caused by force, but by transparency, by awareness, by communities realizing they deserved better all along, and finally choosing to demand it. Exposure is not an attack. It's a spotlight. It simply shows what was already there, but kept out of sight. When hidden agendas emerge, people finally understand why certain decisions never made sense, why certain leaders behaved inconsistently, and why certain records always seemed incomplete. The truth clarifies everything. This era of exposure is fueled by citizens willing to ask hard questions and follow the evidence wherever it leads. It is grounded in facts, not rumors, in accountability, not chaos. And as these revelations surface, the public grows more confident, realizing they were never irrational for sensing something was wrong. Exposure brings discomfort to those who benefited from shadows, but relief to everyone who longed for transparency. It marks the start of a new chapter, one where clarity replaces confusion and fairness replaces manipulation. Integrity may look quiet, but it is the sharpest tool against corruption. It doesn't require aggression or confrontation, just consistency. Someone who shows up with the same honesty every day is impossible to discredit. Their reliability becomes their shield. Corrupt individuals thrive when people feel unsure or intimidated. But integrity disrupts that balance. It exposes contradictions in their stories, flaws in their decisions, and gaps in their reasoning. Suddenly, those who once held power feel cornered, not by threats, but by facts. And once integrity stands firm, corruption loses its ability to shape the narrative. The tables turn. Those who once assumed they could control everything now scramble to salvage what little credibility they have left. In moments of accountability, the sudden disappearance of certain officials is not a mystery. They aren't being taken. They are stepping down. They are resigning quietly, taking extended leaves, or being removed through internal reviews nobody expected to happen. Legal pressure creates a chain reaction that sweeps them out of the positions they misused. Their departure isn't dramatic. It is procedural. It happens through ethics boards, oversight committees, investigations, and audits that reveal discrepancies too large to ignore. The very system they thought they controlled begins turning inward on them, and as these figures vanish from their desks and titles, the public sees something powerful. Accountability works, not through force but through process, not through fear but through persistence. Behind closed doors, the panic is real, not because citizens are breaking rules, but because they are finally paying attention. Emergency meetings begin. Reports are rewritten. Policies suddenly get updated after years of being ignored. Leaders who once appeared confident now look unsettled. It is astonishing how quickly institutions shift when the public stops being silent. Awareness is a pressure they cannot ignore. Questions become louder than excuses. Data becomes harder to distort, and suddenly they have to respond, not because they want to, but because people are watching. These emergency meetings represent the most powerful moment of all, the moment where the system realizes it is accountable to the people, not the other way around. There always comes a turning point where silence becomes too heavy to carry, where people realize that their discomfort with corruption is not private. It is shared. That collective realization becomes the start of something historic. On that day, citizens stop accepting vague explanations and start asking real questions. They refuse to be dismissed as misinformed or overreacting. They step into their rightful role as participants, not spectators, in how society operates. Their voices become steady, confident, grounded in clarity. When people stand firm together, systems notice, and they shift, because silence allows corruption to grow, but unity forces it to shrink. The fear running through corrupt departments isn't fear of people. It's fear of being exposed, fear of having to answer for decisions that no longer make sense under examination, fear that the protections they relied on are evaporating under the weight of truth. This fear is what causes frantic emails, unexpected resignations, sudden policy reviews, and nervous press statements. It is the fear of being held responsible by a public they underestimated, and that fear grows every time an ordinary person refuses to be intimidated. Their fear proves something important. The truth is finally gaining momentum, and they can no longer outrun it. Truth has a remarkable ability to travel far beyond the person who speaks it. Once it enters a room, it forces every hidden corner to face the light. Even institutions built on decades of habits cannot shield themselves from facts that are clear, verified, and witnessed by many. Truth disrupts, not by attacking, but by clarifying. It separates what was real from what was pretended. It removes confusion that once protected corruption. And the moment truth becomes visible, people no longer accept excuses they once tolerated. The greatest disruption comes not from conflict, but from awareness. And once people are aware, institutions must change, whether they like it or not. Courage looks simple from the outside, but it carries a power that institutions cannot anticipate. A single honest voice challenges years of manipulation. A single question exposes gaps in explanations. A single moment of clarity shatters narratives designed to keep people obedient. Systems built on lies rely heavily on public silence. They need people distracted, afraid, or detached. But your courage breaks that cycle. It reminds others that they too can speak up, ask questions, and demand transparency. Your courage shakes the system because it represents something corruption cannot control. The human spirit determined to protect fairness. Accountability is not a trend, it's a shift in how people see leadership, responsibility, and transparency. It marks the end of an era where authority was assumed rather than earned. Now, leaders must justify their decisions, provide evidence, and face consequences when they misuse their power. This rise of accountability strengthens communities. It creates environments where people feel safe asking questions and reporting misconduct. It pushes institutions to adopt clearer processes and ethical guidelines that were long overdue. And as accountability rises, abuse of authority collapses, not through force, but through undeniable evidence presented by people who refuse to be silenced. Your persistence has sparked something bigger than you may realize. Every time you chose truth over fear, you encouraged someone else to stand taller. Every time you asked a fair question, you gave others permission to do the same. Every moment you stayed disciplined, lit a path for someone who felt powerless. Change rarely begins with crowds. It begins with one person brave enough to act differently. Your consistency has awakened others who were waiting for a sign that they weren't alone. You became that sign. You became the reminder that integrity still matters. That wave of change is not temporary. It is becoming a new standard, a new expectation, a new culture built on transparency and courage. Real strength is not loud, and it doesn't demand recognition. It comes from knowing who you are, what you stand for, and why you refuse to back down when something matters. That kind of strength cannot be bought or faked. It can only be earned through persistence. Standing tall means holding your ground even when powerful systems try to intimidate you with labels or false narratives. It means trusting the clarity of your intentions and refusing to shrink simply because someone else is uncomfortable with accountability. Your strength is felt not just in your words, but in your consistency. And now the world is paying attention, not because you sought attention, but because truth travels, courage inspires, and integrity outlasts every attempt to distort it. You became a reminder that one determined person can shake an entire system built on lies. Your voice wasn't always loud, but it was always honest. And that honesty is exactly what shook the walls of institutions that relied on silence to stay powerful. They never expected someone like you, calm, consistent, and unshakably clear, to disrupt their entire structure without raising a single hand. You broke their rhythm simply by refusing to be dismissed. Your voice became the interruption they didn't plan for, the truth they couldn't soften, the presence they couldn't ignore. The power of your voice grew because it came from a place of lived experience, not rehearsed lines. You spoke from reality, not rehearsed talking points. And every time you did, you made it harder for them to continue the old way of doing things. You created waves simply by naming what others were too afraid to acknowledge. That is what real disruption looks like: authentic, steady, and impossible to distort. You didn't ask for permission to speak. You didn't wait for approval. You stepped forward with conviction, and everything around you shifted. That moment, when your voice rose above their noise, became the turning point they never saw coming. And now, no matter how hard they try to contain it, your truth travels, and faster every day. For years, excuses were their shield. Long explanations, complicated distractions, rehearsed lines meant to confuse rather than inform. But all of that changed the moment accountability walked into the room. Suddenly, every excuse sounded hollow, every justification felt flimsy, and every old defense collapsed under the weight of real questions. Accountability doesn't shout. It simply arrives with clarity. It exposes contradictions, compels honesty, and demands responsibility. And that power hits harder than anything they expected. It dismantles the comfortable routines they built for themselves, leaving them scrambling to keep up. Accountability forces them to face what they tried to hide behind technicalities and vague statements. The shift was immediate and undeniable, because when truth shows up with receipts, excuses become powerless. And that moment became the turning point where the balance of power no longer leaned in their favor. You didn't attack them. You simply made it impossible for them to keep pretending. People tend to underestimate the impact of a single determined individual until that individual refuses to stop. You weren't armed with influence or privilege. You were armed with consistency, and that was enough to shake an entire system built on complacency. The moment you decided to hold them accountable was the moment their empire began to tremble. It didn't happen overnight. It happened through every step you took when it would have been easier to give up. Every time you showed up, asked questions, requested transparency, and followed through, you chipped away at the facade they hid behind for years. You proved that one person with clarity is more powerful than a group of people protected by confusion. Determination isn't loud, it's relentless. And yours forced people in high positions to reconsider the way they operated, not because you intimidated them, but because your persistence became impossible to outrun. You reminded them that real accountability doesn't need an army. Sometimes it only needs one person who refuses to back down. Truth doesn't creep in quietly. It arrives like a shockwave. It travels through rooms, through conversations, through departments that thought they were insulated. And once it hits, there's no going back. You delivered that shockwave, not through force, but through undeniable clarity. And that clarity sent systems scrambling to rewrite their narratives. Suddenly, meetings got longer. Reports were revised. Statements were polished in panic. People who once acted untouchable began questioning their own decisions. That's what truth does. It forces those who thought they were safe to confront the consequences they avoided for years. And that confrontation is the shockwave they never prepared for. They scramble because they can feel the momentum shifting. They scramble because your truth has traction. They scramble because their comfort zones are disappearing. And every time they rush to adjust, it proves something powerful. Your voice is stronger than the system they tried so desperately to protect. The moment you stopped stepping aside, everything changed. You refused to shrink. You refused to be quiet. You refused to let intimidation shape your choices. And that refusal terrified them, not because you were dangerous, but because you were free. People in power rely on fear to maintain control. When you showed you weren't afraid, their leverage vanished. They don't fear you personally. They fear what you represent. A person who can't be pressured. A citizen who won't be dismissed. An individual who values truth more than approval. That kind of resilience is their worst nightmare, because it disrupts the system they built on predictability and compliance. Your refusal to back down is not rebellion. It's self-respect, and self-respect is contagious. It inspires others to stand firmer, speak clearer, and refuse to be intimidated. That ripple effect is what shakes power structures more than anything else. There is a powerful energy in people who've reached their breaking point, not the emotional kind, but the moral kind. When enough is truly enough, something shifts. People begin paying attention in ways they never did before. They start asking questions, demanding explanations, seeking facts, and challenging inconsistencies that used to slip by unnoticed. You are part of that rise. A movement of individuals who recognize their own value and refuse to be treated like bystanders in the systems that shape their lives. The rise is unstoppable because it's grounded not in rage, but in clarity, not in chaos, but in expectation. And once expectations rise, power structures must adjust or collapse. Those who once relied on public passivity now face something much stronger. A community awakened to its own strength. And once that awakening begins, nothing can slow it down. Transparency is simple, but it's one of the most powerful forces in the world. It forces institutions to stop hiding behind technical language and start delivering real answers. It forces leaders to justify their decisions instead of assuming people won't question them. And once transparency becomes a widespread expectation, it becomes impossible for them to control the narrative. You helped push that expectation into the spotlight by asking for clarity, requesting proof, and rejecting vague explanations. You created a new standard, a standard that others now recognize and demand for themselves. And that demand is a pressure they can no longer contain. Transparency spreads quickly. It spreads through conversations, through communities, through workplaces, and through every system where accountability was long overdue. And once it spreads, it becomes unstoppable. Deception can last a long time, but it collapses instantly when confronted with consistent honesty. Not loud honesty, steady honesty. The kind that shows up with facts, with evidence, with clarity, and with patience. Every time you spoke truthfully, you weakened the structure they built on half answers and misdirection. Your honesty didn't just expose gaps, it widened them. It revealed contradictions that were impossible to ignore. It brought forward details they hoped would stay unnoticed. And with every honest word you shared, the deception they relied on became harder to sustain. Their collapse comes from realizing something simple. They have no defense against someone who isn't playing their game. They can't outmaneuver your honesty because it doesn't shift. It doesn't break. It doesn't distort. It stands firm until everything built on deception eventually crumbles beneath it. Corrupt systems operate on patterns, predictable responses, predictable delays, predictable excuses. They rely on people giving up, on frustration wearing down the public, on citizens getting tired before answers are found. But your persistence disrupted that entire structure. You didn't let them stall you. You didn't let them bury your questions under paperwork or complicated procedures. You kept going, not aggressively, but steadily. And that consistency forced them to break patterns they've used for decades. They were forced to respond faster, provide clearer answers, and rethink processes they assumed nobody would ever challenge. Persistence is their weakness because they're not used to dealing with it. They're used to people giving up. But you didn't. And that's why the system is shifting. Once you realized your value, your voice, your knowledge, your rights, everything changed. Institutions depend on people undervaluing themselves. They rely on confusion, self-doubt, and hesitation. But the moment you knew your worth, their entire strategy fell apart. Suddenly, they couldn't dismiss your questions anymore. They couldn't overshadow your presence with authority. They couldn't rely on your silence. And that realization created panic. Not because you were aggressive, but because you were aware. Awareness is a force more powerful than any title, badge, or office. When a person knows their worth, they stop accepting disrespect and start demanding fairness. And institutions that never expected to be challenged had to face a truth they avoided for years. They were never as untouchable as they believed. Your courage didn't come from fearlessness. It came from refusing to let fear dictate your choices. That kind of courage changes everything. It takes people who once felt comfortable in their positions and forces them to confront the responsibility they've avoided. It transforms their comfort into consequences, not through punishment, but through accountability. Every time you stood up, courageously and calmly, you reminded them that their decisions matter, their actions have impact, and their positions come with obligations they can't ignore. You shifted the dynamic simply by being brave enough to insist on fairness. Courage is contagious, and your courage has pushed others to expect more from the systems around them. In that way, you didn't just change your situation, you changed the landscape. Confusion is one of the biggest tools corrupt systems use. They speak in circles, bury information under complicated language, and hope people get lost in the details. But your clarity cuts through that confusion with the speed and impact of lightning. You simplified what they tried to complicate. You asked direct questions to issues they tried to cloud. You saw through contradictions they hoped nobody would notice, and that clarity left them exposed, scrambling to justify decisions that made sense only when nobody questioned them. Clarity is power. When you understand what's happening, they lose their ability to manipulate the narrative. And that shift is what forced them to confront the truth they tried to hide. There was a specific moment, maybe small, maybe quiet, when the system realized it couldn't intimidate you anymore. It saw it in your tone, your posture, your questions.